Welcome back. As the threat of U.S. tariffs on Canadian businesses and products looms, our next guest says Canada needs a shot of adrenaline and should stop playing defense with the United States. Let's bring in David Detomasi. He's a professor with the Smith School of Business, and he joins us now from Kingston. David, thanks a lot for joining us. How should Canadian businesses be thinking about all of this right now? We spend a lot of our time talking about the government response, but what should businesses be thinking and doing right now?
Well, thank you for having me, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will answer the question as best I can. For businesses, I think they have to see about beyond the policy uncertainty of the next 10 days, which of course they're enormously preoccupied with, and try to figure out for themselves how they can pressure our own country to do the things we probably need to do to reduce our vulnerability to trade fights with the Americans, and perhaps increase our own domestic competitiveness first. So that's something I think we can talk a little bit about in terms of what we should be doing domestically rather than worrying about Mr. Trump.
And what should the Canadian response be? I should say the government response. The playbook is pretty simple. When an adversary or a trading partner, I should say, slaps tariffs unjustifiably on your products, you respond dollar for dollar with tariffs on that country's goods, particularly perhaps in this case in Republican parts of the country where Republican lawmakers may contact the White House and say, hey, give us a break here.
I'm sure to your latter point that those Republican congressmen are already doing that. I would just simply say that not all trade balances and deficits are created equal. And the Canadian one is very different than the Chinese one, very different than the Mexican one. What I think we should be focusing on in Canada is how do we reduce the vulnerability of those tariff barriers to ourselves? And there's a lot of things we can do. For example, we have huge levels of interprovincial trade barriers that are at least as big and hurt our competitiveness every bit as much as what Mr. Trump may choose to do. We also have lack of exports, pipelines for our natural gas and oil products and other sorts of products we can ship beyond the United States. It's very easy to say it's all Mr. Trump's fault and we should slap retaliatory tariffs, and clearly electoral politics will demand that. But over time, we've got to talk about how we got into this place in the first place and how do we reduce our vulnerability, not just in the next 10 days, but in the next 2 years, the next 5 years.
And what kind of policy decisions would reflect that orientation? We're heavily reliant on one customer for our goods. Much has been made about our relative lack of pipelines, for instance, that can take crude oil and for that matter, liquefied natural gas to non-U.S. markets. If fixing that situation is a multi-year scenario, what else can we do?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think we can lower our internal tariff barriers in terms of interprovincial trade. We absolutely must reduce the regulatory burden investing companies face, not just in energy and mining and other, but in just about everything. It takes far too long and is far too expensive and takes away private capital, particularly when Mr. Trump is promising to remove those regulations in the U.S. case, which I believe is a big part of Elon Musk's kind of mantra or his main directive. Our regulations are too high, they take too long, our investment capital is too low. Our tax policy, we don't have time to get into all of it, but is regressive for that types of investment. It doesn't encourage the investment that we need. So we need to have a whole revamp of how we approach the economic problems. And I think the tariff war, Mr. Trump, just reflects where we fall short and what we need to do.
You know, I don't think there's anybody who believes the level of interprovincial trade barriers we have in this country make any kind of sense in a modern economy. They are a legacy of economic thinking of decades and decades ago, and yet nothing ever happens. There's never an initiative, a federal provincial meeting held with the idea of scaling down these absurd restrictions on the movement of products among Canadian provinces. How realistic is it to expect progress there?
Well, if it's framed in the proper way, Canada, as the former Deputy Bank of Canada mentioned, is in a national economic emergency on all kinds of fronts. Our productivity is simply awful compared to where it should be. A decade ago, we took about $3,000 less per capita coming home every day than our American compatriots. Today, it's $35,000. We have all kinds of other economic challenges, of which this is one. And I think Canadians have gotten a little complacent and thought that we could just keep doing the same old, and the rooster would never come home, so to speak. And I think it kind of has now. And if framed in a kind of the national economic urgency that it warrants, I think there could be, and if the leadership is in place in the federal government, which I'm sure we can talk about, something could be done now because the situation is so dire. But, if the window passes and we muddle our way through, we may not be able to address them and just remain, as you just mentioned, in the decades of muddle we've just gone through.
I don't want to drag you too deeply into the world of politics, but it's certainly possible we'll have a change of government sometime at the federal level in 2025, i.e. the polls are suggesting a conservative majority is possible. Might a conservative government be more inclined to pursue some of the policy options you think are wise?
I think so. I mean, we will have a change in government. Either we'll definitely have a change in prime minister. The Liberal government's having a leadership review right now. And if the polls are very strongly in favor of the Conservative government, who has been touting basically a return to conservative economic policies that enhance our oil and gas development, open up trade, and a couple of other things that might buy us some good stuff with the United States. For example, we need, everyone admits, to spend more on national defense. We can talk about that, but we don't even come close to where we probably should be. And Mr. Trump's arguments about border security and security measures in general, some of them make a lot of sense, and we should be doing them because Canadians need to do it for themselves, not because we're kowtowing to any foreign group, but because in order to be a strong and respected country in the world, you need to have strong and respectable things to argue why. And right now, it's tough to make that case.